in Charlotte for about 12 years now. For most of that time, I was a reporter. For the majority of that time, my beat was growth and growing pains. It's kind of how I defined it. I've written about why Charlotte's growing so fast. Can you all see on Zoom now? Yep. Great. I've written about Charlotte's growth, the growing pains that come with that, like traffic, increased rent, housing prices, the flip side of growth, like displacement of people who have lived in neighborhoods for a long time and now they're changing very quickly. The benefits of growth, like how when I moved here, there was one brewery. Now there's like 200 or something. So that's always been something that's really fascinated me, is land use and all that goes along with it. Although in my day job now, I do a mix of writing, editing, research reports, working with people who have a lot of letters after their last names and are full-time researchers. I still do some freelance writing on the side for local news outlets. If you pick up the current issue of Charlotte Magazine, you'll find a feature story that I did about the 2040 plan, kind of what went into it, what it means, and what's next. So writing, growth, development are still very close to my heart. And in my day job at the Urban Institute, those are some of the issues that we research and write a lot about. So my goal is to talk for probably a little shorter than your speakers typically talk for. I was told 25 minutes. I'm going to aim for like 20-ish because I wanted to leave more time for questions at the end. I really enjoy questions, and I'll just say you can ask questions about Charlotte's growth. You can ask questions about the media scene. You can ask questions about a five-legged puppy, what happens to it, how did it get 5 legs, how many legs does the puppy have now. I will say, out of all the decade of reporting in Charlotte I did and all the things I covered, the 5-legged puppy was the very first real story I did and probably still the most popular. So I peaked very early. Lily is doing okay. 5-legged puppy, she's still around. She's getting older now though. So the 2040 plan, how we got here, what's next? Charlotte is a city that, can't see the title up there. I'll tell you what it says. Growth is baked into Charlotte's, I think I said DNA.
Keep talking.
That's okay. These are some newspaper special section. It's a newspaper special section on the left and a report from the 50s on the right. Oh, perfect. Look at this. Tech is flowing perfectly now.
Don't jinx me.
So on the left, that's a special report about all of Charlotte's amazing growth from the 50s. It's a little too small for you to read, but I can say it says, "This is Charlotte, Queen City of the South, a good place to live and a good place to do business." It touts all the city's achievements, like a 10,000 seat Coliseum, a 2,000 feet seat theater, which is now Bojangles, a $4 million airport expansion, which was really something at the time, and a $2 million extension of something called Independence Boulevard, which was going to help the city really grow and expand. The report on the right side there, How Shall We Grow, is from the 50s. It's one of my favorite old Charlotte documents. It's a vision plan about how we can grow and develop. And a lot of the things that it highlights there are still the questions we hear today. How will we provide for schools? Traffic, they were really concerned at that point because there were something like 100,000 cars on roads in Mecklenburg County. 100,000 cars, that was seen as a big problem. You can see the city limits are what's highlighted in red. These are other incorporated areas up there that are some of the smaller towns. You got like Matthews up there, you've got some of those towns, but that was Charlotte at that point. And since then, I mean, a strain of boosterism is just kind of natural to Charlotte. The scale of Charlotte's growth is not just the population, which was 281,000 in 1970, about 50 years ago. Annexation has expanded our geography massively. Each one of these successive rings is another decade in Charlotte's growth. Physically, you can see now we're down into Steel Creek, way down here into Ballantyne. Now we've eaten up most of the county that's unincorporated. This was just the 1970s. So that's how much Charlotte's grown geographically just since then. There's all kinds of markers you can put on that. Population, that's as of 2019, which is the latest census estimate for the city limits. That's a 20% increase. Daily flights, 50 million passengers, 20 miles of light rail, 30 plus breweries, 9 Fortune 500 headquarters, political conventions hosted 1.5 after COVID, had the DNC in 2020 and like one very brief meeting of the RNC in 2020. So this is the skyline, and all those buildings in purple are either under construction or coming soon. So, just in the next 5 years, we're going to see a massive increase to the skyline based on compared to what we've seen in the last few years. And it's not just our urban core, although that gets most of the attention and headlines. You can also see we are still continuing to annex large amounts of area around the city's perimeter. This is a map I put together. These are annexations that have happened just since 2019. So Charlotte is growing not just at the center, but very quickly at the edges. Most of these are around 485, which is where we're annexing somewhere in the neighborhood of a square mile every year. So land area wise, we continue to increase. And that's really the context that this 2040 plan comes to be in. Sure, yes.
And if we're gonna cover this in 2040, totally skip my question. But why the growth? Like, why does Charlotte need to continue to acquire land and population?
Well, I think there are several factors driving that. We see consistently lower real estate prices than a lot of the places where people are coming from. We have a lot of population influx from New York, the Midwest, upstate New York is a big population draw. But the other is employment. The number one place where people who move to Charlotte come from is other places in the Carolinas. We're a huge employment draw, and that's led to a lot of people moving here. Now, you ask, kind of why do we need to? I think there are a few dimensions of that. I've always said that the problems of growth are preferable, in my view, to the problems of decline. If you look at places like Detroit that have struggled a lot with problems like tens of thousands of empty houses and what to do with those. We have the opposite problem. We have a big housing shortage, but I'd still prefer to have that. If you look at the why do we need to acquire land question, I think that is maybe a better question for, is it a good idea or not? There are a lot of people who will point to this map and say, that's sprawl, that's making traffic worse, that's, there are something like 5,000 housing units included in this. So that's building more auto-dependent areas. Does growth pay for itself is kind of the big question. I think that's an open question. People will say sprawl does not pay for itself. So is it a good idea to keep annexing like this? That I don't know. But in general, Charlotte's still kind of a very insecure city in my experience. There's a lot of cities that have less boosterism than Charlotte. And I think that's kind of directly attributable to so much of Charlotte has grown just in the last 50 years. So really, in a lot of ways, that kind of underlies a lot of conversations in Charlotte is what happens if the growth stops. Ever since I've been here, that's kind of a subcurrent. We can talk a little more about that. So this is the project timeline just for the 2040 vision plan, which the city started in 2018 when the new planning director, Taiwo Jaioba, came on board. We've been rewriting the development rules in this city for longer than that, basically for more than a decade. But Taiwo put the brakes on that and said, we need a vision plan before we actually rewrite the nitty gritty rules. So, you know, this has continued for 3 years through all these different phases. And the goals have been spelled out by the city in 10 different kind of wonky bullet points. So I decided to just put what I see as the 3 goals that the city has really pursued here. And this is just from my perspective as someone who's observed and reported on this process for a while. Goal number 1 of the plan is to reduce sprawl and create greater urbanization. This is Ballantyne Corporate Park, which is, you know, only about 25 years old, but you can see for every one of these buildings, just a massive amount of surface parking. You know, Ballantyne was laid out on the corporate park itself, somewhere like 530 acres. Only about 25% of that is occupied buildings. The rest of that is parking and the golf course. So, you know, Ballantyne, their new owner's goals are to basically fill in all these parking spaces with buildings, fill in the golf course with buildings. They've already made the golf course a public park now, not a functional golf course. And, you know, over the next few decades, they hope that Ballantyne will look more like this, with all these apartments and, you know, bike paths and built up places on what used to be that sprawl. One of the major goals of the vision plan, and one thing that a lot of the different points of it push towards, is making this kind of development easier than this kind of development, and pushing developers and people who are buying real estate towards this vision. This is especially true around areas like the Silver Line light rail, new transit nodes, new places where they want to see mass transit. So that's one overriding goal that a lot of the city's methods point to. You can also see this in Dilworth. You can argue about whether it's a good idea or not. This is, I used to live a block from this intersection. So this is right here at Moorhead and Kenilworth. That's what was there when I moved here. And that's what's there now. You know, I don't love that building, but it is massively denser. You went from, I think, 8 units on that lot, maybe 12, to 240. So, and then I think catty corner across from it, you've got another 800 or so apartments in all those intersections. So you've got just a massive increase in density, very close to the city's core, where the largest employment center is. That's a goal that they really want to pursue. Goal number 2 is to do something about the housing crunch we're in. That number on the left, 16,000, that's how many houses were on the market in the Charlotte region 7 years ago in a given month. And that number on the right, 3,104, is how many houses were on the market in Charlotte last month. So you've got roughly an 80% reduction in for sale home inventory over the last 7 years here, which is really kind of stunning. And if you haven't tried to buy or sell a house recently, it's a total nightmare. I mean, we've got 25% year over year price increases for housing. And a lot of that is because we've got this huge shortage. So the plan really points to greater density. That's what the whole duplex and triplex, letting those be built everywhere. That is kind of the impetus for that, is allow greater density, and then allow more streamlined development process to make building easier and quicker. And that's all taking place in the context of this huge housing crunch. And goal number 3, which is maybe the most contentious, is to fix the sins of the past. These are maps from the Quality of Life Explorer that the Urban Institute produces. And without any keys, you can see they're all different versions of the same map. You've got a kind of a dark blue, denser wedge here, and then lighter areas out here. some more dark blue here, dark blue, and these are all different versions of the same map. And the city and the county pay us to produce these maps, and I hope they don't notice that they're paying us to produce 80 versions of the same map, because
And this is a density map?
no, what these show is income, white population, educational attainment, proximity to a pharmacy. Yes.
Eli, a lot of this data is from like 2017, 2018. Any
Yes.
idea when it's going to be updated? Because I use this a lot.
Yes, most of those updates are coming with the new round of census data. So a lot of this is delayed because the census, 10-year census was delayed. So hopefully we'll have new, more up-to-date versions of a lot of these soon. Yes, a lot of these estimates are from 2018 or 2019, which is the most recent. And then even age of death. So we see the same patterns in where people live, how much money they make, how educated they are, and even how long they live. There are neighborhoods here in the Southeast Wedge where people live on average 15 to 20 years longer than some of these lower income, predominantly minority neighborhoods, east, north, and west of Uptown. So that is one of the guiding principles of the 2040 plan. It's trying to do something about a lot of this racial and economic segregation that we still see in our city. And that is a really thorny thing to do. So, on one level, I think a lot of this all sounds good. We can say reducing segregation. Sure, that's great. We can say increasing housing supply. That sounds good. Bringing housing prices down. Sure. When I interviewed the head of the real estate building industry coalition, he said, on its own, this all sounds like, God, motherhood, and apple pie. Great. But if you've been paying attention to the news for the last 6 months, this has been a hugely contentious issue. It only passed by one vote. City council was deeply divided over this. The community has been deeply divided over this plan and a lot of the values in it. So what got in the way? I want to talk briefly about 3 factors that I think made this plan so contentious and have made this such a really hot button issue in the community. The first, that's Mayor Lyles. This is a screenshot I made that I think really just exemplifies this process and what it felt like going through it. Yeah, I tweeted this and it got retweeted like several hundred times and mentioned in a lot of local media. And
called you later and was like, "What up, man?"
I don't know if she loved it or not, but she did mention it later on the radio on Charlotte Talk, so I know she saw it. But
Did she think it was funny? Or did she agree with it?
I think it's you're either laughing or crying situation, because they held literally more than 100 hours of meetings about this plan at City Council, more than 100 hours of really ugly discussion. COVID, remote meetings, and interpersonal conflict, I think, played a big role in why this was such a contentious plan. It's tough to say exactly how much the fact that they had to switch to all remote meetings for a good year of this planning process got in the way. But I do think that that was a big factor in why City Council never really gelled. There are also interpersonal conflicts on City Council that I think really came out. There were a lot of ugly remarks. Yeah, I don't know what that was, but.
Rohit, I mean, not Rohit, sorry, Ranjit.
So I think we're good.
Is that you?
I think we're good. I just heard it for a second there. So, Council Member Ed Driggs said in a Republican meeting that you can, something to the effect of you can still, even though we're in the minority, stop plans if they're being done by stupid people, implying that his colleagues were stupid people. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Braxton Winston said that supporting single family zoning was racist and people who supported it are being racist. Some of his Democratic colleagues wanted to preserve that. And some of his Black colleagues on city council wanted to preserve some form of single family zoning. So that remark created some conflict. So I think there were interpersonal conflicts that were magnified by the fact that so much of this was not done face to face, it was done over Zoom meetings. Single family neighborhoods are really a third rail in American politics. This is one of my favorite movies, of course. It's A Wonderful Life. I love this movie. We watch it every year. But if you boil it down, the story of this movie is George Bailey wants to sell people houses, and he's great and good. Mr. Potter wants to build rental housing for people, and he literally destroys the town of Bedford Falls by building a vibrant mixed-use rental housing based community. So, you know, for me, that always kind of crystallizes a lot of our attitudes towards it. As soon as people really heard that the plan got rid of single family only zoning, that really, you know, just touched off a huge wave of opposition. It's difficult to underestimate, or it's difficult to overestimate how explosive an issue that is. So that was a really big role in why there was so much controversy about this plan. And then the emergence of strange bedfellows, of interesting political alliances, really made this a much more interesting local political fight. You know, you might think stereotypically, affordable housing advocates would want this plan because it's about trying to make housing more affordable. And, you know, maybe Republicans and developers would want this plan because it lowers land use regulations and makes it easier to build without going through rezonings for a lot of things. And maybe Democrats would be all for it because they want more affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. But it really didn't break down that way. You ended up with some developers allying with some affordable housing advocates because the developers were opposed to some of the greater regulations in the plan, and the affordable housing advocates were worried about gentrification and disrupting existing single family neighborhoods. You ended up with the two Republicans on council allying with 3 Democrats to try to oppose it, which is something you don't see very often in our polarized environment. And the Democrats who opposed it, Matt Newton, Victoria Watlington, and Renee Johnson, said they were concerned that this plan would lead not to greater housing affordability, but to greater gentrification. So there were a lot of really unconventional local political alliances that made this process take a lot longer and become a lot more contentious and interesting than your stereotypical, you know, NIMBY fights, as I put them. So, you know, what's next? There's still a lot to come. I think one fact that a lot of people maybe haven't really realized is this plan is the first step in a process that then leads to a lot more steps. So this plan doesn't actually have the force of law. It's meant to guide the rewrite of the actual zoning laws, which will take a few more years. That's the Unified Development Ordinance Process, or UDO. So you'll hear a lot more about that. Basically, we're not done yet with the fighting. The next big policy questions related to the plan, I think, are going to be things like our tree canopy action plan, what the city is trying to do around that, affordable housing, what Charlotte does with expanding its affordable housing program, and the transit plan, which is, you know, a $12 billion ask that they're going to be coming to the state legislature and local development and local voters for in the next year or so. And, you know, guess what? The 2040 plan, a lot of that hinges on building more transit lines. So if the transit plan doesn't pass, if the transit tax that they're going to propose doesn't pass, a lot of what we just saw occur, not to say it's for naught, but will not be as applicable. So that's coming. And then I think both sides have really emphasized how earth-shattering this plan is going to be. But frankly, I think we're most likely to see things continue as they have. You know, Minneapolis, which passed a similar change to its zoning laws to allow duplexes and triplexes everywhere. They're a couple years in and they've only seen a few dozen duplexes and triplexes built throughout the city. The market especially in a regulation light state like North Carolina, is going to continue to drive a lot of what we're seeing. We're going to keep seeing the housing crunch. Frankly, this plan will change some things and it might set the tone for development to come 20 years down the line, but especially in the next few years, especially while we're still seeing things like the zoning rewrite that I mentioned, and we don't know what's going to happen next with transit, it's going to be a long time before we see things actually start to look different. So I think we're going to continue seeing the same market-driven development, housing crunch, high prices for real estate that we've seen so far. So that's it. Charlotte, good place to live, good place to do business. They said it in the 40s. I think they still say it now. And I'd love to take some questions.
I have a question if I can ask it.
Yes, please, sure. So I stop my screen sharing here. I'm still not good at this. Oh, there we go, red button.
Go ahead, Gene.
Oh,
Yes, please.
the Coliseum. Where was the original Charlotte Coliseum and what year was that? And where have been the subsequent Coliseums and what years were they built?
So the very original one on Independence, the first domed one, that was, I believe, 1965, I want to say. 53. Okay, well, there you go. I'm terrible at that. You know, then they had the one on Tyvola that they detonated. But yeah, my father-in-law is from Mullins, South Carolina. And, you know, at the time, he says that was the original Coliseum in the 50s was the biggest thing for miles and miles and miles. So he still remembers driving up and seeing that as the skyline. So.
Yeah, that Coliseum on Independence, when it was built, was the largest dome in the world when it was built.
Are you talking about what's now the Bojangles Coliseum?
That's
Yes.
correct. Yeah, largest freestanding dome in the world at the time.
Wow, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
I'm not sure if the tree canopy is what this question is about, but I know for the longest time, Charlotte was really intent on keeping a lot of trees and green. Is that changing with all this housing that they're wanting to build?
And just to make sure I heard you right, are you talking about the tree canopy?
That's what I'm not sure. Is the
Yes.
tree canopy trying to keep a lot of trees and
Yes.
greenery?
So Charlotte, City of Trees, has one of the highest tree canopy cover percentages for any major US city. It was about 49% in 2012. And the city's goal was 50% tree canopy coverage by 2050. 50 by 50, it's nice and round. Increasing tree canopy is important because especially as things get hotter, trees keep everyone cool, et cetera, et cetera. So since then, however, there's been so much development and so much of it has taken out large areas that are large forested areas that our tree canopy has actually declined from 49% to 45%. I did a project on this with one of our researchers last year. We're losing the equivalent of 3 football fields a day of trees in Charlotte over the past decade. So because we're losing so much tree canopy, the city has kind of quietly backed away from the 50 by 50 goal, 50% by 2050. Now their goal is going to be more around, frankly, trying to maintain as much as we can of what we have. So 50 by 50 is probably not going to happen. They're trying to maintain more trees in dispersed areas like pocket parks, like neighborhoods. They're trying to buy more existing trees through the Tree Canopy Save program. But frankly, it's really hard, you know? And the goal of building more density conflicts with the goal of preserving more trees. You know, if you go to neighborhoods like Cotswold, there's great old growth trees. And then, you know, there's a lot where you have an 1,800 square foot ranch house on 1/3 of an acre that's very dense trees. Well, someone comes in and knocks it down, knocks all the trees down, builds 4 houses on that lot. You've increased the density by 4, which goes along with the city's goal of building more density close in, but you've knocked down 1/3 of an acre of trees, which goes against the goal of keeping the tree canopy. And that's a really good example of the conflicting ways that we're seeing development pull Charlotte. And there's no easy answer because you can't have both in a lot of cases. Yes, we got some questions in the room. Kelly.
So mine was actually very similar to that. So what you're saying is the 2040 plan, they have basically outlawed single-family dwellings to new single-family dwellings in the plan?
No, that's a big misconception. People think that there's no more single-family houses allowed. What it says is any lot that you can have a single-family house on, if you want to, say, build a garage behind your house, build an accessory dwelling unit, you can do that. If you want to put a duplex there, you can do that. But if you want to build another single-family house, you can do that too. So
they're basically just opening up the ordinance to say you can do more than just
yes,
single-family dwelling or house.
Yeah, so the ordinance will say you can build more, you could build a duplex and a triplex, not just a single family. So it does not say you cannot build single family houses in the future. It also does not override HOA existing covenants. So that's, a majority of neighborhoods in Charlotte. One question that people had is a lot of the neighborhoods that aren't covered by HOAs are older neighborhoods, majority minority. So one question people had is, are we going to end up in a situation where we have a lot of wealthy areas that are protected by HOAs where you can't build a duplex or a triplex, and all the development pressure even more shifting to areas like Druid Hills, Wesley Heights, Enderley, Biddleville, historically Black neighborhoods where now there's even more pressure because it's like, that's where development is wide open. So that's a big concern people have.
Is there also not, also when you reduce the tree canopy, you also reduce the air quality. And with a higher density within the core of Charlotte, the air quality is going to get worse, even with transit, like putting in new transit. And then when you reduce the tree canopy, it's going to make it even worse. So like the quality of life is now going to go down even further for folks that live in Center City.
So I think that's another really good example of these kind of trade-offs that are so tough in development, because if you don't build more density, you get a lot more of that map I showed where there's all those annexations and new subdivisions around, 485, around Mint Hill, Fort Mill, et cetera, et cetera. So you can have a situation where it's like, do you preserve the inner core neighborhoods we have now and push a lot of new growth to the outside? And then you have tens of thousands more people driving in every day. Is that worse for air quality than maybe losing some tree canopy and building more densely close in? And then maybe you have people who are not driving 25 miles each way. Maybe you have people who are driving 4 miles each way. So you can't do it all. And it's really tough. And if I knew all the answers to that, I'd go somewhere and make a lot more money, but yeah. Yes.
So you're speaking about transportation.
I'll repeat it too.
So driving technology seems to be in the midst of change and about to change even more. So the prospect of electric cars, fewer emissions, potentially driverless cars. So like when you look at shows the Valentine parking lot, and I live in the South Park area, so I think a lot about how much parking space is allotted in South Park Mall, which is the center of Charlotte
Yeah.
and how that's going to factor in how you think driving technology is going to change.
Mhm. So,
When you're developing public transit,
yeah.
but also thinking about parking space, that's hard. How do you?
So yeah, the question was about new driving technology. How will that change development, driverless cars, all that? I think there's two parts of that. One is how does it change the built environment? So how much parking do you need to build if there's, say, driverless cars? And the other is how does it change things like commutes and how we actually move from point A to point B? I will say I'm not an expert on this, but I think that it will change the first part, the built environment, probably more than the second, because if you look at a place like Uptown, even when they're building new office buildings, you have somewhere around 3 parking spaces. No, I'm sorry, 1.5 parking spaces, maybe 2 per 1,000 square feet of office space. So if you're building a new 1 million square foot office development, that's a huge parking deck with thousands of parking spaces. It's a big cost for developers. Developers don't like it. City planners don't like it because, it creates huge dead zones in the middle of your city where you have a parking garage instead of something more vibrant. And workers don't like it because it's really expensive. I mean, my wife, when we were paying for her parking uptown, that was, $2,000 a year for us. So I think if everyone has driverless cars, if that technology comes along, you could build a lot less parking because you could just get dropped off and then your car goes and drives to some central parking structure out of the way. And then it comes and picks you up in the afternoon. So you could build a lot less parking, and you're already seeing that happen in cities. Charlotte has reduced its parking minimums for transit adjacent buildings. The first 2 parking-free apartment buildings are under construction in Charlotte, both near transit lines. So, an apartment building with no parking is kind of a big deal in Charlotte. And driverless cars is one reason why people are thinking about that in the future. I'm less optimistic about how that changes the second part, how we actually drive from point A to point B, because say you take the university area where I have to drive into work 2 or 3 days a week now that they want me back on campus in person. There's about, I think, 90,000 jobs in University City. About half the people commute there. Let's just expand it to Mecklenburg County because it's easier to think about. About half the people who work in Mecklenburg County commute from another county. So, that's a few 100,000 people a day. If you take those few 100,000 people a day and they're all commuting in self-driving cars, but they're all still commuting in cars, you get some gains around the margins. The self-driving cars maybe don't get into accidents. Maybe they can drive a little closer to each other than humans do. Maybe they can drive a little faster and merge more smoothly than humans do. But, a 25-mile drive from Gastonia to Uptown, or from, Cabarrus County to Ballantyne, is still a 25-mile drive, whether it's a human drive or a car drive. So I think you can probably get some gains around the margins there. Maybe that takes you 30 minutes instead of 40 minutes, but I don't know how much that reduces commute times. Like, I don't think it magically makes them disappear. But hopefully I'm wrong.
What is, Charlotte is 50th in upward mobility, or some of us listed out 50 cities where the worst. Does this plan really fundamentally address equity in the community, and how does it address it?
So that famous study about Charlotte being 50th out of 50 in economic mobility, that really kind of landed like a hand grenade in the local conversation here. That really shocked people. That's one of the reasons why equity and those maps I showed you and trying to change some of that is at is built into this plan. The plan does that by trying to make housing prices more affordable. One of the thoughts is by allowing housing types like duplexes and triplexes in more neighborhoods. Those are generally cheaper. Maybe you'll have less segregation. Maybe people will be able to afford to live somewhere in a duplex that they couldn't if it was all single family. So there's also some goals around, there's the 10-minute neighborhood goal, which is trying to get everyone in a neighborhood where they can access essential services like, supermarkets and, schools, et cetera, without driving. And food deserts and pharmacy deserts are a big problem in parts of Charlotte.
And book deserts.
Book deserts, yes. The map of access to pharmacy looks exactly like the maps of, racial distribution in Charlotte. If you live in certain majority Black neighborhoods, you're miles and miles farther from a pharmacy than you are in South Charlotte, where you might have 4 within 1 mile. And all that stuff has snowballing impacts on people's health. So the plan aspires to address those by influencing land use to reduce residential segregation. But it's really difficult to do that, especially in a regulation light state like North Carolina, where the city does not have as much regulatory authority around things like housing as there are in other states. For example, mandatory inclusionary zoning is a term that means telling developers you have to include X percentage of affordable units in a new development. Cities in some states can do that. Cities in North Carolina can't. Things like mandatory impact fees, that means when a developer wants to build something new, you say, okay, you want to build X number of houses, you have to pay $200,000, which we're going to put towards a new park, or we're going to maybe subsidize a grocer to come be in this neighborhood, or whatever it might be. We can't do that here. Community benefit agreements, that's something else that was in this plan. That's a term that is similar, but it means when a developer comes into a neighborhood, they have to pay for a benefit to that community, like public art or better sidewalks or whatever it might be. So those are things that are in this plan as aspirational goals, but which the city can't currently do. So
Can they do tax breaks? I mean, I know the land use plan can't necessarily.
you can do some tax breaks. You do get tax credits for affordable housing, but it's a huge amount of red tape. So I think the plan aspires to do that, but a lot of it is frankly just aspirational, because it's a situation where in some ways everything comes down to land use, and what you allow to be built places has huge impacts on everything from people's health to their education to economic mobility. But we're in a market-driven society, we're in a market-driven development system. Like Charlotte's saying, we're going to allow duplexes and triplexes in more neighborhoods is not going to wipe out residential segregation in the city. So I think there's a bit of a mismatch between aspiration and what'll actually happen. And I think there's also, on the flip side of that, a mismatch between what people are afraid will happen and what will actually happen in terms of people who are scared, like there's not going to be any single family neighborhoods. So there's a mismatch on both sides. Yeah.
So you mentioned this in your longer article that you wrote about this.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of goes off of what you've been talking about as far as what the city has power to do, and maybe what our state legislator has. So I'm interested, do you hear any rumblings about, even if this thing got passed, and we know who makes up the majority of those in the city government, but our state legislator is made of much different people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a growing number of states that have actively created laws to have more control over primarily Democratic cities. So I'm wondering, have you heard anything about the legislature stepping in and saying, you can't do this, we're going to create more policies to prevent cities from enacting certain?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because you're correct. I mean, that's happened in Charlotte in recent history. You know, we saw that with House Bill 2, HB 2, and the non-discrimination ordinance. When Charlotte passed that, the legislature came in and quashed that immediately. Now, however, we've got, you know, that's expired and a bunch of cities have passed LGBT protections and the legislature hasn't. So there's also there was a bill in the legislature, or there is a bill because, you know, the session's still going at the state level to mandate cities allow duplexes, triplexes, and that sort of thing all over. So there's actually a law backed by some Republican legislators to do this, you know, changes to single family zoning. And their view is we're lessening regulation, we're allowing people to do more with their own property. So there's kind of different dynamics in play. I don't think that there's anything that is in this plan that would necessarily provoke that kind of reaction. But some of those things that I mentioned as what the city has defined as aspirational goals, they would like to explore things like getting mandatory inclusionary zoning for affordable housing. They would like impact fees. They would like community benefit agreements. But those require legislative approval. Those would require some kind of legislative approval, legislative delegation of authority to Charlotte. And I don't think that those are kind of non-starters at the state level right now. So those aspirational goals, Charlotte would have to go to the legislature and say, please let us do mandatory inclusionary zoning. And that's not going anywhere in the legislature. So, yeah. Also, I noticed we have the same watch. Good taste.
Yes, all right.
All right, if anyone else has any questions, maybe Elaine would like to stick
Yeah,
around for
sure.
a couple minutes. Let's see.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Really fascinating. If I could do, you could do two things for me.
Okay.
One, would you pick a winner and read the last four numbers of our raffle?
All right.
So stick your hand in there, and our lovely assistant Gus will banner white for us.
Let's see. All right. The last four digits of the winner are 4177.
Wow. You won last week.
He's giving me a 25% cut afterwards.
Yes,
We
exactly. Exactly. And then we would also like to give you one of our handy dandy Dilworth South and Rotary mugs. Great for tea, coffee.
I love it. Thank you. It's Friday.
This is fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Don't mind sticking around. And if everyone could please, well, do we stand for the five-way test? Okay, let's stand for the five-way test. Put your large change, meaning dollar bills, in there. In the front pocket. And of all the things we think, say, or do, first. Second. Third. Goodwill and better friendships. Fourth. Will be beneficial to all concerned. Fifth. So thank you guys. I'll ding this little bell. Ding, ding, ding. Yay. Thank you guys for being here. I swear we're gonna have the technology work out next week. So excited. Or if not, we're gonna be meeting like in the parking lot, like kumbaya. Like that.